Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the April edition of our monthly look ahead, our monthly EU advocacy look ahead on this wonderful sunny Brussels day. And happy 1st of April. We are doing this every month. For anyone who's new, welcome to those who are returning. We're glad to see you back. We take a look each month at the month ahead. What are the salient policy events coming up? What else is happening at an institutional and policy level? And we provide insights and advice focusing on advocacy for the month ahead, and in some cases a little bit further ahead. We are lucky to have with us as expert speakers each month, Alan Hardacre and Paul Shotton of the firm AdvocacyStrategy, which you should check out if you haven't heard of them yet. It is really a new departure in public affairs consulting in the world of EU affairs and in fact beyond, in that it's very focused on best practices and methodology and really a 360-degree view of the practice of advocacy and professionalizing advocacy, and it's really worth looking at what they do, because it's really an innovation in this world that we have here in the bubble. I am Michel Ehrlich. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Lanzcape, which is also a groundbreaking and new departure in the world, in our case, of monitoring, legislative monitoring. And one of the things that we are doing, and we're the first ones, is providing advocacy advice in our app. And that advice comes from Alan and Paul and the Advocacy Strategy Consultancy. And that is a premium service within the app, but you can start using the app for free and get very detailed, very systematic, and very structured policy monitoring, legislative monitoring. Just go to landscape.com, grab the app and create an account and start using it, and let us know what you think. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Alan, and then I will come back to you at the very end. And I'm sure we're going to have an information-packed webinar this month. I've had a look at the deck, and there's a lot in there. So, Alan, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michel, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all good and enjoying our April 1st, as Michel said. So yes, let us get straight into this. So, okay, we are going to do what we usually do. We're going to go through the institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, and the councils. We're then going to have a quick look at any other developments in the Brussels space that we think you should keep your eye on. And then through that, we're going to give you a little bit more guidance and ideas around how you can structure your public affairs this month and beyond to be more effective. So if we jump straight in terms of where we were last month, so from last month's webinar, we did a lot of work on the strategic meaning and context of the work program initiatives. We reviewed them. We looked at what was coming up in Q1. We also then looked at what did that mean if your issues were in the work program 2025 or not in the work program 2025, because those of you who follow things closely will know that work program 2026 is now kicking off as a process. So we looked a little bit at that and what you would have to do if you wanted to tackle that. And then, although a lot of focus was on the work program and the Commission, we outlined a little bit in the March session about preparing for work with the Council and the Parliament, who soon will be receiving a significant amount of documents from the European Commission. So if we go very top line for April, so what we see then is the Commission is moving back to the normal flow of proposals, not just legislative, if I'm honest here, because the legislative proposals, as we will see in a second, are the smallest part of the mass of nearly 90 different proposals that are going to come out this year, the majority of them are non-legislative or legislative reviews. So, top line advice is, probably people have been looking at what was flagged in Q1, remembering that the work program came out exactly halfway through Q1, and that is now probably attention is focusing on Q2 and Q3. And again, I can't stress enough, recognizing the different nature of work on a legislative file versus a non-legislative file. So legislative, of course, being much more specific, much more targeted amendments in terms of, specific articles, whereas the more non-legislative file is horizontal, broader level engagement, which just requires a different mindset and a slightly different strategy. So, as a reminder, what do we have looking Q1, Q2? You can see that it's a real smorgasbord of different proposals here. As I said, as a reminder, then you have legislative, but again, if you can see here very clearly, we're talking about 7 legislative proposals before the end of June this year. That is actually not very many. But then if you get into the non-legislative, we start to hit double figures. And then when you hit midterm evaluations and then all of the different fitness checks, again, we have a very high number. Again, to stress the different nature of the work that's required on these 3 different sets of proposals that will be coming from the Commission into the legislative machinery. So that's just the context at which we're working in right now. And again, of course, if you are really looking to be effective, you will also be planning for what's coming up in Q3 and Q4. We're only showing you here literally where we are right now. But of course, anything that was flagged as Q1 is as good as written. We're past Q1, obviously, but there's still some overhang from Q1. If you're in Q2, the majority of that has also been written. So again, for any more preemptive work where you're trying to shape things, you need to have eyes on Q3 and Q4. So if we then look at what is happening right now, so really the Commission back into its normal flow of business. Now it's the normal cycle of things. But as we know on the slide, it's business as usual, but it's not operating as usual. I'll explain what that means in a second. So business as usual means that we're now in the normal flow of the Commission machinery, where now they have a long list of target proposals to get out. All the DGs and services are activated. They have clear targets to meet. That is what they are now looking to do. So flagship proposals that we see at the moment, for example, the first and second omnibus packages. So obviously trying to simplify in the fields of sustainability. So looking at the corporate sustainability reporting directive, the due diligence directive, the carbon adjustment mechanism, and the Invest EU regulation. We then have the Critical Medicines Act, the CMA, which is looking or tackling critical shortages of essential medicines in the EU. And then thirdly, we have the new approach on returns. Okay, so the new approach on returns is creating common procedures for issuing return decisions and a European return order going alongside national return orders. So they're kind of 3 of the flagship legislative proposals. And then we say business as usual because we're now falling into the normal annual cycle. So now the Commission is starting early stages to think about Work Programme 2026. It does sound ridiculous that we're even talking about this, given that we're 6 weeks past the publication of Work Programme 2025, but this is the normal cycle. We're then also, of course, starting to think about the summer retreats of the college, to think about the work programme, to also think about the State of the Union that von der Leyen will give, usually in September of every year. So again, we're back into the normal cycle of things as is the usual flow of operations. However, what is very clear, it was already quite clear, there were some emerging trends in the last Commission, but they are absolutely becoming apparent in the current Commission, is that it is not operating in the same way as it used to. So clearly, and we've flagged this on previous webinars, that the Commission is inherently more political. Decisions are being taken more top-down than bottom-up. We have more and more instances of cabinet getting involved in drafting text, taking decisions on text, And we're now even starting to hear that inter-service consultations are actually almost being pre-agreed by the Cabinet before the inter-service consultation actually starts. So there is a much heavier hand, political hand, coming down from the Cabinet onto the operations of everything coming out of the Commission. This means that if you're working with the Commission, you have a new challenge or a new set of challenges to face, that your technical engagement with the services may be very good, but if that's not aligned with what's happening politically, you could be in trouble. Which means I think that the political level, the Cabinet level of the Commission is probably highly sought after and in demand for meetings as people start to recognise this. So in terms of relationship building, it becomes somewhat critical. Now, if we look at the normal flow of process, and this is just what we wanted to show you, I appreciate that you won't be able to discern all the detail, and this is from the 2019 to 2024 Commission, but basically it exists the same for this year. We have the same process map. The Commission internal process, albeit somewhat more political, it basically follows the same very clear process. You have an inter-service steering group, you have the lead DG, you filter through member state expert groups, you move into inter-service consultation, and then you go into the final decision-making procedure of the college to get something adopted. So what we mean here when we say the windows of opportunity are marked is you can set out a map, a generic map for exactly how your issue is going to work its way through the Commission. The challenge, of course, is then trying to be ahead of yourself, find out when the meetings will happen, who will be sitting in those meetings, so you can actually get your engagement going. So the Commission follows a clear process. You can highlight all the windows here of opportunity, and there are some very big ones: member state engagement, the inter-service steering groups, and the inter-service consultation being the most obvious ones. So again, the process here, know the process, know the steps, understand what's coming, and then be sure not to miss any opportunities. You need to bring the right information and evidence on time. Obviously, this is a much more data-driven process than with the two other institutions that Paul is going to come on to in a second. So this is about more shadow impact assessments, more data, more studies that the Commission will need to also then justify what it's putting in its proposals or evaluations. About solutions, and again, really can't stress enough how you can map this out in advance and get ahead of the game. So these process charts are extremely useful tools to use. So if we look at then, what do we think is the key things for April 2025 when it comes to the European Commission? So it's keeping an eye on where is it in terms of all of the different initiatives that it said it's going to publish. Is it falling behind? Is it on track? And of course, where do your initiatives sit in here? If you're looking at something to be proposed in Q2, you really need to be in deep planning mode for what you're going to do about it when it's proposed. Okay, so depending on where you are in the final stages of the Commission process, maybe there's still some opportunity there. But if you know it's coming out, then of course your planning is going to be a little bit more towards where Paul is going to go with the Parliament and the Council. And then, of course, just as a reminder, we've had this from the beginning of the year to frame any engagement with the Commission in terms of how it's contributing to the Commission's goals. Okay, so if this was this time last year, it would have still been some green version of the world of the future. Now it's a little bit more competitive industrial view of the world. We've had a bit of a pivot as to what the Commission is trying to achieve. Okay, so the Commission is pretty critical with all of these things coming through, and also as you start to think of 2026. But of course, increasingly now, your attention should be turning to the other institutions. So that's a little bit where we go to with the European Commission and the month of April. So plenty to be looking at. Stress the flowchart approach to really structure your engagement as best you can. And with that, I think Paul is going to take over and talk us through the Parliament, the Council, and the other developments this month. Paul.
Right, thank you very much. Yes. So let me just move forwards. Yeah, so indeed, in the European Parliament, in the coming month, we're right now in the midst of a plenary session running for the next week, where we're already seeing quite a lot of these developments that you were talking about, Alan, starting to flow through from the Commission. Though, of course, there are still many files that are still coming across from the former mandate. So there's still a lot of work being brought over from the pre-election cycle, or certainly files that were started before the elections, and moving into the new parliament. Indeed, so we have a plenary session this week and then committee meetings coming up in the rest of the month. And it's worth noting that already when looking at the current plenary session, we see, for example, in the Environment Committee has forwarded 3 reports on the European Chemicals Agency and REACH, carried over from the last mandate, with very specific regulations, 2 regulations and a directive, all around, indeed, data sharing and restrictions and sharing technical and scientific tasks. Moving on, then we see also that the plenary will be receiving an update from the European Council conclusions, where some of the big themes at the moment are being discussed, of course, and we'll see these themes coming up again and again, whether it is the war in Ukraine, the situation in the Middle East, European defense, competitiveness. So some of these new themes that Alan mentioned coming across, and the new priorities, and of course, reflecting the new environment that we're operating within. Statement from the High Rep as well, looking at Russian war crimes. And very interestingly, we of course have this urgent procedure right now amending the corporate sustainability reporting and due diligence requirements. So indeed, rapid moves by the Parliament to take the decisions necessary to, well, review this proposal and this legislation to push back indeed some of the deadlines by a year. Just to recap on this very important piece of legislation, like I mentioned, the Parliament's looking to postpone the application of those new rules by a year. And that would then, of course, mean that the requirements would apply from 2028 to companies with more than 3,000 employees and 900 million in turnover. And so, of course, this remains very large, and a small number of very large companies that are affected by this delay. There are also some votes, of course, on some of these legislation that I mentioned around REACH, and we'll be seeing also discussions a lot around common foreign and security policy, common security and defense policy, human rights, the situation in Turkey right now, the situation in Gaza, and of course, the situation in Hungary as well, all coming up and well-established topics at the moment. We see also some updates around the COP16 and biodiversity, where the states have agreed to resume COP16 talks in Rome coming up, with a view to mobilizing, I think it is 200 billion in resources within the next 5 years. So that's a little bit some of the main points. Maybe one last one worth mentioning is that the debate on rare diseases will also be coming up at the end of the plenary session. So we see a mixture of both foreign and external relations, and of course ongoing legislative files and debates. The committees have started work. Like I mentioned, most of the committees are still, of course, dealing with the legislation carried over from the last mandate. It was 110 plus files that were carried over. And we're seeing some new files, just a quick glance at the Environment Committee and others looking at, for example, wolves and CBAM, as well as things like the toy safety and AI issues are all working their way through now the European Parliament's committees. So it's well worth indeed going to the Legislative Observatory, doing a search to look at some of those files, looking at the current term and the current year and ordinary legislative procedure potentially, and keeping an eye on what's coming onto the agenda and where it is within that legislative process. So our advice indeed right now is, of course, to, if your issues are on the agenda, of course, to engage with MEPs with whom you have pre-existing relations. Hopefully some of them will be willing to champion your causes, making sure that they participate in the debates, that they, of course, understand the importance of participating in any relevant votes taking place in this or, of course, in the future plenaries. And of course, at the same time, like Alan mentioned, the European Commission being more politicized right now has a major role, as you know, either reporting back to the Parliament or, of course, reacting to decisions and actions of the European Parliament. And therefore, it is important to engage with that institution with a view to them, of course, coordinating and making statements and hopefully aligning with you to frame those debates within the Parliament, and certainly keeping you informed about their intentions around that. So like Alan mentioned, the plenary is starting to see now some of those issues coming through from the 2025 and the new work programme, as well as from the previous work programme. And thus it is important that you start allocating your resources towards the committee work, as well as tracking those files as they go through. Notably, for example, the Green Claims proposal in trilogue at this point in time. Turning our attention, to the Council. In the Council, of course, the Polish presidency is now in full swing. Quite a transition from the Hungarian presidency. Security, given its position geographically, and of course, given its reliance on agriculture, we see some major themes coming up in the Polish presidency, notably security and defense, highlighted by the presidency's 7 pillars, which include, of course, security, defense, protection, borders, resistance to foreign interference, energy transition, and competitive and resilient agriculture. So not particularly surprising themes for the Polish presidency, given its context, but of course, important drivers for its priorities and for its work steering and chairing discussions and debates and organizing events around the Council. So right now we'll see in the coming month, we'll see there will be informal meetings, for example, of defense ministers in the coming days. We will see also culture and media ministers meeting in next week, economic and finance ministers thereafter, Foreign Affairs Council, and, for example, towards the middle of the month, we will have gender equality ministers meeting. All, of course, relevant to those issues that I just highlighted right now. So we're going to see, of course, these things coming back up. Interesting to note, again, in a geostrategic position, so these things are coming up rather a lot these days. We see that there was the first meeting of the EU Central Asian Summit, which took place in Uzbekistan, seeking to strengthen cooperation between the EU and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. So the EU seeking to leverage its role as a major investor in the region, and of course, seeking to then build stronger bridges with these countries, and which of course must be viewed in the context of the current conflict in the Ukraine. Finally, worth noting, but maybe not so central to our discussions and our focus on the European Union, but the Finnish local elections or county elections will be taking place, which may also give a little bit of a litmus test for some of these more geostrategic issues, as well as for concerns around populism. So what to do? Well, given that there will be a lot of informal meetings, it should be good for you to keep track and prepare to monitor those meetings and those developments. The Polish presidency is, of course, a key driver right now, and definitely your key partner and the one to watch and the one to reach out to, whether it is through the perm reps or through the ministries or through the national agencies, in order to gather information about discussions and debates, understanding what's about to take place and what's currently the state of discussions. But we must, of course, keep an eye on the Danish presidency, which is starting to take shape. We're halfway through the first half of the year. And if you haven't done so already, this is the time, of course, to map the Danish presidency, looking to identify key actors in Brussels, in the ministries, in the agencies. Of course, Denmark right now is in the news again, whether it's around Greenland, whether it's around trade threats, and of course will be coloring its own priorities in the coming mandate around these rather severe and somewhat existential issues for the country. So make sure you look at your legislative timelines, looking at the proposals coming out in the first half of the year as well as in the second half of the year. And, looking at what Alan shared with you right now in terms of the Commission's timeline for preparing and delivering legislation, project and use that to project yourselves for those key proposals in the Work Programme 2026 and in the second half of 25, with a view to aligning your engagement strategy with those processes, looking to ensure that for those proposals that are not yet complete, you have the opportunity to contribute, notably to the inter-service consultation, taking into account that point, of course, about the cabinet. So that's the main points indeed right now. And moving on to some of the smaller and more peripheral developments, we have the European Innovation Council running a summit tomorrow and the day after. Well, tomorrow will be a little bit more about workshops on investments IP, but more interestingly on that will be Thursday. There will be some workshops on topics such as the innovation gap, European startup scale-up strategy, well worth your attention and participation and open to you if you're interested to go. NATO will be having a meeting of foreign affairs ministers. The program is still to be confirmed. But of course, these are very, very fluid times within NATO. US policy is really being played out in the media, as many people have told me from within NATO. So it is really an opportunity for you to keep a close eye on these developments and see how they unfold, notably with the United States' participation and representation at NATO. An energy summit looking to explore driving innovation, affordable energy, very relevant to the transitioning from the Green Deal context to the Clean Industrial Deal. And there will be a retail summit as well, looking at the evolution of consumer rules and digital fairness and other points. Moving on, so really the main points here, or the main advice we have when it comes to these events is, of course, to use these conferences and opportunities as a means of developing alliances, of meeting key stakeholders, and really taking maybe a structured and explicit approach towards organizing and ensuring that you achieve this. So think about what you're going to do before the event, at the event, and after the event, whether it is a research council conference or other event. So make sure, for example, when thinking about your alliances, to map out the stakeholders attending the events, make sure you think about tailoring, preparing some speaking notes, making sure you know what to say when you're at the events. Make sure you plan and you set up some opportunities to network and connect with people for coffees and other opportunities. These are very key opportunities for you to build your network on some of these key topics with relevant stakeholders. And of course, very importantly, and something we often forget to do, make sure you follow up. So whether that is to confirm the topic that were discussed and to confirm the next steps that were agreed with those you have met with, hopefully to collaborate or certainly to share information. So think about that, whether it is in a view of building alliances or whether it's in a view of mapping and engaging with key stakeholders. And I think that then takes me down just to a last point around some of the holidays. So though they're not very long, we should bear in mind that the holidays around Easter will, of course, delay a little bit the institutional activities. We lose a Monday. And of course, that means that it is well worth you taking a moment to think about getting organized and communicating well in time before these breaks, ensuring that if you want to share your positions or get some meetings with MEPs, that all of this is done well in time before the Easter holidays. And of course, after the break, maybe just to send reminders out and reconnect to ensure that you remain top of the mind. So that's the main points about the institutions. And I think Alan has a very interesting point now about delegated and implementing acts.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Paul. As we try to do every month, we showcase a different way of being more structured and process-driven in your public affairs work. And this month, we decided to focus on how we manage implementing and delegated acts. So, and we do this deliberately for two reasons. I think the first is because we believe this is a best practice, and it's very important to embed best practices in your public affairs work. Secondly, we do it because at the moment, a lot of people are very focused on the legislative, non-legislative, all the excitement around the work programme, whilst beneath the surface of the iceberg, there are many hundreds, if not potentially thousands, of implementing and delegated acts that will need to be prepared this year. Just as a reminder, every year we have in excess of 1,000 implementing acts and around about 200 delegated acts. These far outnumber any legislative and non-legislative pieces of legislation that come from the European Commission. And then also, we also have to remind ourselves that the European Commission spent the best part of the last 3 years trying to push through a huge amount of Green Deal legislation, most of which has a number of implementing and delegated act requirements sitting behind it. So we think it's important that you take a bit of a structured view to how you're going to manage this alongside the other legislative and other activity you have. So we've just basically taken an example and we've snapshotted a little bit of the packaging and packaging waste regulation that was recently adopted and published in the official journal. So basically what we believe is a best practice here, and soon, Michelle, it would be remiss of me not to mention that soon the Lanzcape platform will auto-generate this for you because we think it's so important, is what is the actual part of the legislative text that requires the delegated act? So that's the first column. So establishment for design for recycling products. What else do we have here? Sustainability criteria, minimum number. Okay, so what is the specific requirement in the first column? Secondly, is there a date? New legislation will always have a date by when this delegated act should be in place. So here you see, for example, within 3 years, or some are actually specific, the 1st of January 2028. The reason that date is very important is because it gives you a bit of a sense of an order in which they're likely to come. And you can also work backwards because delegated acts, as we will show next month, also, like the commission that we showed earlier, they have a very specific process and timeline. So we can show what that is, look at this date, and then work backwards to understand the latest point at which the commission would need to start work to have a chance of adopting it by this deadline. So the content, the due date, and then maybe the other two are a little bit of an internal assessment. You know, what could the impact of this specific delegated act be on your organization? What you're doing here is a little bit like what you would do for your normal public affairs priorities, is you are trying to give some sense of prioritization to the number of implementing and delegated acts. Because as you are probably aware, one single piece of legislation can give birth to many implementing and delegated acts. So it's very important to know which are the critical ones for your organization. So a bit of an impact column that can be in numbers, monetary values, or at least an impact statement that helps you decide between them if you're going to give your energy to trying to follow them. And then, of course, the right-hand side is what is your ability to then influence these delegated acts? So how good are your contacts with the Commission services? How good are your contacts with the member state expert group who is likely to be assisting the Commission? And then how good are your contacts in the Parliament if ever it comes to a question of needing to object to the delegated acts? Now, that's a very useful tool for you to have and take a bit of an assessment, talk to your organization, show them what's coming and where you're prioritizing. It would be remiss of me then not to mention how difficult this exercise becomes when you're trying to follow things, because as you all know, the information on implementing and delegated acts is not public information. Yes, there is a comitology register. The comitology register is extremely useful for academics who want to have a look at what happened last year and the year before. If you're working on a live issue, unfortunately, you have to do things the old-fashioned way. For those of us in a certain generation, it's called a telephone. We have to phone people, we have to get information. There is no other way to do it. Okay, so we can focus on that a little bit more next month when we go a little bit deeper into implementing and delegated acts. So that's the delegated acts in this particular example. And here are some of the implementing act provisions. We've done the same thing again. And again, hopefully you can already see from the list of items that we see on the left-hand side and the due dates on the second column, already giving us a great flavor of what's coming when. It's also a very nice way to communicate this back to our organization from a business continuity perspective or an organizational continuity to understand what is coming when, to give you a flavor. It's not as specific. Before could be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months before, but at least it gives us a sense of the order of attack here. And again, the impact and ability to influence, and again, the same challenges of following the developments of an implementing or delegated act and your need to get information from somewhere to do this. So basically, that rounds off what we wanted to do with you this month. So just as a bit of a reminder, as I said at the beginning, all of these different proposals coming from the Commission, your attention should be starting to move to what's coming Q2, Q3, and your planning around this. As I've just discussed now, making sure that you don't forget or lose sight of the implementing and delegated act. So be sure to have that exercise we've just discussed with you done in the background. And then, as Paul mentioned, not only is the Commission moving into business as usual, the European Parliament committees also moving very much into business as usual. So really making sure that you are connected, you have the right monitoring platform in place to tell you what's happening and any presence that you may require. It would be also fun of us if we didn't put down on the April checklist, it's Easter. So that's as much for the institutions as for the rest of us to take a small but well-earned long weekend in the midst of all of this political and legislative chaos. So that is a little bit of our April checklist. And then again, as we always remind you every month, our view at Advocacy Strategy is that structured public affairs or process-driven public affairs is critical. And again, that comes from how we prioritize, a little bit like we did with the implementing and delegated acts based on some data and insights. How do we then get all of our information publicly available and non-publicly available? So publicly on legislative, non-publicly for implementing and delegated acts, for example. How do we then map all of our stakeholders and look for different alliances? And how do we potentially use AI to help us these days do this more effectively? How do we turn that into a strategy and tactics, which is then the overarching strategy, and then our direct and indirect tactical approach to how we do things? How do we set this up in such a way that we can evaluate and monitor and measure effectively? And then the bit that we all love, that I'm sure you all have to do, how do we translate this into our internal reporting? So again, all of the structural pieces that we touch on literally every month, some aspect of this in our public affairs practice. So here's our checklist, and then maybe I will hand over to Michelle to close out and see if there are any questions this month.
Thank you very much, Paul and Alan. It was really information-packed. So indeed, as a next step here, are there any questions? I have one that I received during the presentation, but first let me ask, does anyone else have a question? Feel free to raise your hand or send it through the chat. Okay, here's the one I got. It's a little bit, I think it's quite broad, but will the new transatlantic political environment impact institutional attention to the work program, and might it slow that down? Might it slow down the policy agenda as a result? So as we know, there's a huge amount of political upheaval, which hadn't necessarily been expected toward the end of last year as the work program was being finalized, or at least not to that extent. Do you anticipate that it might have an impact on the forward speed of the policy agenda as it had been foreseen for this year?
For me, it's a little bit hard to say, but I can maybe just make one comment, which would be that if you take the example of the automotive industry, where you've seen them transitioning into the new commission with already a strategic dialogue and a refocusing on the competitiveness of the industry and looking at the impact of the legislative agenda from the previous term on the industry itself, we see, of course, that this drive then to refocus the legislative framework on the competitiveness of the European car industry is being very, very heavily colored by this transatlantic relationship. So whether it is the tariffs and the several rounds of tariffs and the discussions between the United States and its major trading partners, not just the EU, but Canada as well, and Mexico, I think you can certainly see that those sorts of developments will really have a significant impact. And, you know, myself, and I look also at debates around gender equality, etc., I think that that will also maybe be colored by debates in the United States that maybe not so directly affected, though surprisingly enough, we are seeing potentially issues around free movement or movement and travel. And also, I believe I saw European or French companies receiving letters as contractors from the United States, asking them to ensure that they are in compliance with new American laws around gender inequality policies and inclusivity policies. So, yes, I think so. I don't know if I've stolen the good topics from you, Alan.
I think, Paul, all I would say is I think, as you've just painted, I think the answer to that question is, in some areas, yes, it will slow things down, as in Europe we need to reflect. In other areas, as you're suggesting, it will probably speed things up as we look to respond or act more quickly. So there is no blanket response to that. I think it's going to be issue by issue. Some things will be slowed down, some things will be speeded up. And it's going to be very important to stay close to that, as we highlighted, to understand what that impact could be and what you're following and what you're dealing with.
Thank you very much, both. And indeed, that does make a great deal of sense. We don't have other questions, so we'll close out. I want to thank heartily our research team, Giacomo and Mirela. Thank you very much. You've put together an extremely substantive slide deck this month. And I would like to thank all of our attendees for making the time for this webinar today. And we will be sharing the deck through various channels publicly. And for those who've attended, we will also share the entire recording. So keep an eye out for that. And keep an eye out for the announcement of the date and the invitation for next month's look ahead. So we're going to continue the series. And thank you once again very much to everyone involved, and have a fantastic 1st of April and enjoy the sunshine. See you next month.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.